The conference room went dead silent when my husband David looked me straight in the eyes and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Sarah, as part of our restructuring initiative, we've decided to terminate your position. Effective immediately." The smirk on his face told me this wasn't business. This was personal. And he thought it was hilarious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What David didn't know was that I'd been recording every board meeting for the past 6 months. What he didn't know was that I'd already registered my own competing business 3 weeks earlier. And what he definitely didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting every client relationship, every process, and every weakness in his precious company for over a year. By the time I walked out of TechFlow Solutions that day, carrying my box of personal items past the shocked faces of my former colleagues, David Martinez thought he'd just pulled off the ultimate power move. He had no idea he'd just handed me the keys to destroying everything he'd built. Because sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is underestimating the woman who helped you build your empire in the first place. 6 months later, I owned his company. But let me tell you how I got there. I should probably start by telling you who I was before that devastating day in the conference room, because understanding my background is crucial to understanding how David's betrayal became the catalyst for his own destruction. My name is Sarah Martinez, and for 8 years, I'd been the marketing director at TechFlow Solutions, a business automation software company based in Austin, Texas. But more than that, I'd been the architect of almost everything that made the company valuable. When I first met David Martinez 12 years ago at a tech networking event in downtown Austin, I was an ambitious marketing specialist working for a struggling startup, and he was a software developer with big dreams and bigger ego. He had the technical skills to build business automation software, but he had absolutely no idea how to sell it, market it, or turn it into a real business. That's where I came in. Our relationship started as a business partnership that evolved into romance, and eventually into marriage 5 years later. From the very beginning, I was the one who understood the market. I was the one who identified which small businesses needed our software and why. I was the one who developed the pricing strategies, built the sales funnels, and created the marketing campaigns that turned David's coding projects into actual revenue. When we officially launched TechFlow Solutions 8 years ago, I wasn't just an employee or even a co-founder. I was the reason the company existed as anything more than David's expensive hobby. Our software specialized in helping small to medium businesses automate their workflows, manage their customer relationships, and streamline their operations. It wasn't revolutionary technology, but it was solid, reliable, and I knew exactly how to position it in the market. While David focused on the technical development and his co-founder Mike Chen handled operations, I built everything that mattered to the bottom line. I developed our client acquisition strategies, managed our major accounts, and created the systems that turned prospects into paying customers. Over 8 years, I'd personally brought in over $6 million in revenue for TechFlow Solutions. I knew this because I tracked everything. I maintained detailed records of every client relationship, every successful campaign, and every process that contributed to our growth. This wasn't paranoia or excessive attention to detail. This was smart business practice for someone who understood that knowledge is power, and documentation is protection. TechFlow had grown from a 2-person operation run out of David's garage to a legitimate company with 42 employees and annual revenue of just over $8 million. We'd moved into a sleek office building in Austin's tech corridor, hired specialists in development, customer service, and account management, and built a reputation as one of the more reliable business automation providers in the Texas market. David loved to take credit for this success during industry conferences and networking events, presenting himself as the visionary entrepreneur who'd built something from nothing. The truth was more complicated, and I'd started to realize just how complicated about 18 months before that fateful board meeting. That's when I first noticed David's attitude toward me shifting in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He'd started interrupting me during meetings, dismissing my ideas before I could fully explain them, and making comments about how marketing was becoming less important as the company matured. He'd begun referring to the technical team as the real foundation of the business, while describing sales and marketing as supporting functions. At first, I attributed this to the stress of managing a growing company. David had always been somewhat egotistical, but success seemed to be amplifying his worst traits. He'd started surrounding himself with people who reinforced his belief that he was a brilliant entrepreneur, rather than people who challenged his thinking or contributed independent value. Mike Chen, his co-founder and best friend since college, had become his primary enabler, constantly validating David's decisions and agreeing with whatever narrative David wanted to believe about the company's success. The red flags became more obvious during our annual performance reviews and strategic planning meetings. David had started questioning the value of our marketing budget, suggesting that word of mouth and organic growth were sufficient for our continued expansion. He'd begun making comments about how the business had evolved beyond needing traditional marketing approaches, and how our focus should shift entirely to product development and customer retention. These weren't just business disagreements. They were attempts to rewrite the history of how TechFlow had become successful, minimizing my contributions while elevating his role as the essential visionary. When I pushed back with data showing the direct correlation between our marketing investments and revenue growth, David would acknowledge the numbers but suggest that those strategies had been necessary in the early days but were no longer relevant for our mature business. The personal dynamic between us had been deteriorating alongside the professional tension. David had become increasingly dismissive of my opinions, not just about business but about everything. He'd started making jokes about how I didn't understand the technical aspects of our product, despite the fact that I'd been working with business automation software for over a decade. He'd begun treating my expertise in market analysis and client relationships as less valuable than his programming skills, as if understanding customer needs was somehow easier or less important than writing code. Our marriage had started feeling more like a business relationship, except that David wanted all the authority of a CEO with none of the accountability that comes with having an equal partner. He'd stopped consulting me about major decisions, stopped asking for my input on strategic direction, and stopped acknowledging that my contributions were essential to everything we'd built together. I was becoming an employee in my own company and a subordinate in my own marriage. 6 months before the firing, I'd started preparing for possibilities I hoped I'd never need to consider. This wasn't paranoia or pessimism. This was pattern recognition. Based on David's increasingly hostile behavior toward me and his growing belief that he could manage the company without my involvement, I opened a separate business bank account under my maiden name, Sarah Chen, and began setting aside money from consulting projects I'd been doing independently on weekends. I also started developing my own software platform, working with a freelance developer I'd met through industry connections. This wasn't corporate espionage or theft of company intellectual property. This was me using my own expertise in market analysis and client needs to create something that would compete directly with TechFlow's offerings. I was building my backup plan, funding it with my own money and my own time, because I was starting to suspect that David was building toward pushing me out of the company I'd helped create. The documentation I'd been maintaining became more systematic during this period. I started recording board meetings using a small digital recorder I'd purchased for legitimate business purposes, telling David and Mike that I wanted to ensure accuracy in our meeting minutes and strategic planning documents. They had no objection because they had nothing to hide, or so they thought. I began keeping detailed records of every client interaction, every successful campaign, and every process that I'd developed for generating revenue. Most importantly, I started building relationships with our key clients that were independent of TechFlow's official account management structure. This wasn't sabotage or preparation for stealing clients. This was relationship building that any smart marketer would do to ensure client satisfaction and retention. I made sure our most important customers knew me personally, understood my role in their success, and valued my expertise beyond just my connection to TechFlow Solutions. 3 weeks before David fired me, I registered a new business entity called Austin Business Automation Solutions. I filed all the necessary paperwork, obtained the required licenses, and established the legal framework for what would become my competing company. This wasn't preparation for revenge or retaliation. This was preparation for survival in an industry I understood better than anyone, including my husband. The irony of David's dismissive attitude toward my contributions was that he'd never actually tried to understand what I did or how I did it. He knew I brought in revenue, but he didn't understand the systems, relationships, and processes that made that revenue possible. He saw marketing as placing ads and sending emails, not as the complex ecosystem of market analysis, relationship building, strategic positioning, and customer psychology that actually drives business growth. This ignorance would become his greatest vulnerability, but I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that the man I'd married and the business partner I'd trusted were both disappearing, replaced by someone who saw me as dispensable despite everything I'd contributed to our shared success. I was preparing for the possibility that I might need to rebuild my career independently, but I was still hoping that David would come to his senses and recognize that pushing me out would be devastating for both our business and our marriage. The morning of the board meeting that would change everything, I woke up in our home in West Austin with a strange sense of anticipation. David had been unusually secretive about the agenda for that day's meeting, mentioning only that they'd be discussing organizational restructuring and strategic realignment for future growth. He'd seemed almost giddy about whatever he had planned, which should have been my final warning that something significant was about to happen. I dressed professionally in my favorite navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to our most important client presentations and successful contract negotiations. I gathered my materials for the meeting, including the quarterly marketing reports that showed continued growth in client acquisition and revenue generation. I had no idea that this would be the last time I'd enter TechFlow Solutions as an employee, or that David's restructuring plan was actually a personal betrayal disguised as a business decision. The conference room was fuller than usual that morning. In addition to the regular board members David, Mike, and myself, there were two people I didn't recognize. David introduced them as consultants who were helping with the restructuring analysis, but something about their presence felt ominous. They had the demeanor of people who were there to deliver bad news, not to participate in collaborative strategic planning. David started the meeting with an overview of the company's financial performance, highlighting our revenue growth and market position. Everything he said was accurate, and much of it was based on marketing strategies and client relationships I'd developed. He spoke about our success as if it were the inevitable result of superior product development and operational efficiency, with only passing mention of the sales and marketing functions that had actually generated the growth he was celebrating. Then he shifted to discussing future strategy and organizational optimization. He talked about the need to streamline operations, eliminate redundancies, and focus resources on core competencies. The language was corporate speak, but the tone was personal. He was building towards something, and I could feel the tension in the room as Mike avoided eye contact with me and the consultants prepared to take notes on whatever was about to happen. When David finally looked directly at me and delivered the words that would end our professional relationship and damage our marriage beyond repair, the shock was total and immediate. Not because I hadn't seen warning signs, but because hearing him say it with such casual cruelty was worse than anything I'd imagined. He wasn't just firing me. He was enjoying it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was demonstrating his power over me in front of witnesses, making sure I understood that he could destroy what we'd built together whenever he chose to do so. The termination itself was presented as a business decision based on changing market conditions and organizational needs. David explained that the company was moving toward a more technical focus, with less emphasis on traditional marketing approaches. He suggested that my skills had been valuable during TechFlow's startup phase, but that the company had evolved beyond needing my particular expertise. The consultants nodded approvingly, as if this were a reasonable strategic decision rather than a personal betrayal disguised as corporate restructuring. Mike Chen said nothing during the entire presentation, avoiding my eyes and looking uncomfortable but not objecting to anything David proposed. This was almost as devastating as David's betrayal because Mike had been my friend and colleague for 8 years. We'd worked together on major projects, celebrated company successes together, and built what I'd thought was a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to TechFlow's growth. His silence was complicity, and his complicity was its own form of betrayal. As I sat there listening to David systematically minimize my contributions and dismiss my value to the company, I felt something shifting inside me. The shock was giving way to something harder and colder. I was realizing that this wasn't just about losing my job or even about the end of my marriage. This was about someone I'd trusted using intimate knowledge of my work and my life to destroy what I'd helped create. But David had made a critical miscalculation. He thought that firing me would eliminate my influence on TechFlow's success and clear the way for him to take full credit for everything we'd accomplished together. He thought that cutting me out of the company would somehow prove that he'd been the essential element all along, and that I'd been just another employee whose departure wouldn't significantly impact operations. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't just another employee, and my value to TechFlow wasn't limited to the tasks listed in my job description. I was the person who understood why our clients chose us over competitors. I was the person who knew which marketing strategies actually generated revenue and which ones were just expensive experiments. I was the person who had built the systems and relationships that turned David's software into a successful business. More importantly, I was the person who had been documenting everything for years, who had been building independent relationships with key clients, and who had been preparing for exactly this scenario for months. David thought he was firing a subordinate employee. Actually, he was declaring war on someone who understood his business better than he did and who had been quietly building the resources necessary to compete with him effectively. As I packed my personal items that day, carrying my box past the shocked and sympathetic faces of colleagues who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed, I wasn't thinking about revenge or retaliation. I was thinking about justice and survival and the satisfaction that would come from proving that David had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. The woman who walked out of TechFlow Solutions that afternoon was different from the one who had walked in that morning. Sarah Martinez, the loyal wife and dedicated marketing director, was gone. What remained was Sarah Chen, independent entrepreneur with 8 years of industry expertise, detailed knowledge of a vulnerable competitor, and absolutely nothing left to lose. David thought he'd just solved his problem by eliminating what he saw as an unnecessary expense and an obstacle to his complete control of the company. Actually, he just created a much bigger problem by turning his most valuable asset into his most dangerous competitor. And he had no idea what was coming. For him, the first 24 hours after my termination were the most critical. While David was probably celebrating what he thought was his brilliant strategic move, I was already implementing a plan that had been months in the making. The shock of his betrayal had crystallized into something much more focused and dangerous. I wasn't just angry. I was motivated by the kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they really are. I drove straight from TechFlow's offices to a small apartment I'd been renting in San Antonio under my maiden name for the past 3 months. David knew nothing about this place. As far as he was concerned, I'd gone home to our shared house in West Austin to process my termination and figure out my next steps. He probably expected me to spend a few days crying, maybe consult with some employment lawyers about wrongful termination, and eventually move on to finding another marketing position with a different company. Instead, I was sitting in a furnished, 1-bedroom apartment with 3 laptops, 2 phones, and 8 years of meticulously documented business intelligence spread across a dining table that had become my war room. The apartment was my operational headquarters, paid for with money from my consulting work that David didn't know existed. It was registered under Sarah Chen, a name that wouldn't appear in any search connected to David or TechFlow Solutions. The beauty of having a marketing background is that you understand customer behavior, market dynamics, and competitive analysis at a level that most business owners never develop. You learn to think systematically about how businesses actually work, not just how their owners think they work. David understood code and product development, but he'd never really understood why customers chose TechFlow over our competitors, or what would make them choose someone else. During my 3 months of preparation, I'd been conducting informal market research that would now become the foundation for destroying David's business. I'd been calling our major clients, ostensibly to check on their satisfaction with our services and gather feedback for future product development. What I was actually doing was mapping their frustrations, understanding their unmet needs, and identifying opportunities where a competitor could provide better value. The information I'd gathered was devastating for TechFlow's future prospects. Our clients were generally satisfied with our software, but they had consistent complaints about responsiveness, customization options, and pricing flexibility. David and Mike had been so focused on technical development that they'd ignored growing client frustration with our customer service and account management. They were treating existing clients as guaranteed revenue rather than relationships that required ongoing investment and attention. More importantly, I discovered that several of our largest clients were actively exploring alternatives to our software. The construction management company that generated nearly $800,000 in annual revenue for TechFlow was frustrated with our limited integration capabilities. The restaurant chain that accounted for another $600,000 in yearly contracts was complaining about our pricing structure for multiple locations. The professional services firm that had been our client for over 5 years was expressing interest in more advanced reporting features that David had repeatedly postponed developing. These weren't just service issues. These were business opportunities for a competitor who understood what clients actually wanted and was willing to provide it. David saw client complaints as minor irritations that could be managed with better customer service responses. I saw them as market intelligence that could be used to build a superior offering that would steal his most valuable accounts. My own software platform, the one I'd been developing secretly for months, was specifically designed to address every major complaint I'd heard from TechFlow's clients. Where TechFlow was rigid, my platform would be customizable. Where TechFlow was expensive for multiple users, my pricing would be scalable and affordable. Where TechFlow's customer service was slow and unresponsive, mine would be personal and immediate. The freelance developer I'd been working with, a brilliant woman named Jennifer Liu who specialized in business automation software, had helped me create something that wasn't just competitive with TechFlow's offerings. It was demonstrably better in the areas that mattered most to actual users. We'd spent 6 months building features that directly addressed client pain points, creating solutions that David had been promising to develop for years but never prioritized. Jennifer had no idea she was helping me compete with my husband's company. As far as she knew, Sarah Chen was an independent entrepreneur who had identified market opportunities in business automation software and was building a startup to address them. This wasn't deception. It was operational security in a competitive industry where information could be weaponized by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to betray trust. The financial foundation for my competitive assault was more solid than David could have imagined. My consulting work over the past year had generated nearly $200,000 in revenue that he knew nothing about. I'd been helping other tech companies with their marketing strategies, working weekends and evenings to build an independent income stream that could fund exactly the kind of operation I was now launching. I'd also been preparing the legal framework for what was about to happen. 3 days after my termination, I had a meeting scheduled with James Wilson, a business attorney who specialized in intellectual property and competitive disputes. James had been recommended by contacts in Austin's tech community, and his reputation for protecting entrepreneurs in complex business situations was exactly what I needed. The meeting with James took place at his downtown Austin office, a sleek space that projected the kind of professional competence I was looking for. I'd prepared a comprehensive presentation that outlined my situation, my resources, and my objectives. I wasn't looking for revenge or retaliation. I was looking for strategic guidance on how to compete effectively while protecting myself from potential legal challenges. James listened carefully as I explained my background, my termination from TechFlow, and my plans for launching a competing business. I showed him the documentation I'd maintained of my contributions to TechFlow's success, the independent software platform I developed, and the market research that supported my competitive strategy. Most importantly, I demonstrated that everything I was planning was legal, ethical, and based on my own expertise rather than any proprietary information belonging to TechFlow. "You're not stealing clients or trade secrets," James said after reviewing my materials. "You're using your industry knowledge and professional relationships to compete in an open market. That's not just legal, it's exactly what the business ecosystem is designed to encourage." James helped me understand the legal boundaries that would protect me from accusations of corporate espionage or breach of fiduciary duty. Since I'd been terminated rather than resigning, and since my non-compete agreement had specific clauses that made it unenforceable under Texas law, I was free to compete with TechFlow immediately. More importantly, since I'd developed my software platform using my own resources and my own time, David had no intellectual property claims against my work. The conversation with James also revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated about my strategic position. By firing me, David had eliminated any ongoing obligations I might have had to TechFlow's interests. I was no longer bound by employee loyalty or corporate confidentiality beyond the basic legal requirements that apply to all business relationships. I was free to compete aggressively, and David had given me powerful motivation to do exactly that. But James also warned me about the personal complications of competing with my husband's business. "This is going to get messy," he said bluntly. "Business competition between spouses is emotionally complex and legally complicated. You need to be prepared for David to respond irrationally, and you need to protect yourself both professionally and personally." That evening, I returned to our shared house in West Austin for what I knew might be one of the last times. David was in his home office, working on code and apparently in an excellent mood. He greeted me with the kind of casual friendliness that suggested he expected me to be grateful for my termination, as if losing my job was some kind of favor he'd done for me. "How are you handling everything?" he asked, not looking up from his computer screen. "I know the transition is probably overwhelming, but this is really the best thing for both of us. Now you can focus on finding something that's a better fit for your skills." The key was executing the competitive strategy faster than David and Mike could respond effectively. Lisa also helped me structure my own business in a way that would support rapid scaling if my competitive strategy succeeded. We established Austin Business Automation Solutions as a Delaware corporation with flexible ownership structures that could accommodate future investment or partnerships. We set up banking relationships, accounting systems, and legal frameworks that would support aggressive growth without creating operational bottlenecks. Most importantly, Lisa introduced me to potential investors who were interested in funding competitive challenges to established tech companies. While I had enough personal resources to launch my business, having access to additional capital would allow me to compete more aggressively and respond more quickly to opportunities as they developed. 3 weeks after my termination, I felt ready to move from preparation to active competition. My software platform was nearing completion, my client relationships were maintained and growing stronger, my legal and financial foundations were solid, and my strategic plan was detailed and executable. David thought he'd eliminated a problem by firing me. Actually, he'd created a much bigger problem by turning his most valuable asset into his most dangerous competitor. The transformation was remarkable even to me. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been Sarah Martinez, loyal employee and supportive wife, trying to preserve relationships and maintain stability. Now I was Sarah Chen, independent entrepreneur with superior market knowledge, better technology, stronger client relationships, and unlimited motivation to prove that David had made the biggest mistake of his professional life. But I wasn't ready to reveal my competitive position yet. David needed to become more comfortable with his belief that he'd successfully eliminated me as a factor in TechFlow's future. He needed to make additional mistakes that would weaken his position and strengthen mine. He needed to demonstrate to clients, employees, and industry observers that TechFlow was less effective without my contributions. Most importantly, I needed to complete development of my software platform and finalize the strategic partnerships that would allow me to compete at scale. The next phase of my plan would require perfect timing and flawless execution. David had taught me to be patient and strategic in building business success. Now I was going to use everything he'd taught me to systematically destroy what he thought he controlled. The woman who had walked out of TechFlow Solutions 3 weeks earlier carrying a box of personal items was gone. What remained was a competitor who understood David's business better than he did, who had superior technology and stronger client relationships, and who was about to demonstrate that firing her had been the beginning of his end rather than the solution to his problems. The breakthrough came exactly 5 weeks after my termination, and it wasn't something I had planned or anticipated. I was having lunch with Rachel Thompson, TechFlow's former HR director who had quit 2 weeks after my firing, when she told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about David's motivations for eliminating me from the company. Rachel and I had maintained our friendship despite the awkwardness of my termination. She'd been one of the few people at TechFlow who had openly disagreed with David's decision to fire me, and she'd eventually resigned in protest when it became clear that David was planning additional layoffs that would gut the company's operational expertise. We'd arranged to meet at a small cafe in downtown Austin, ostensibly to catch up on industry gossip and discuss her job search. "There's something you need to know about why David really fired you," Rachel said, lowering her voice and glancing around the cafe to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "It wasn't about restructuring or reducing marketing expenses. It was about something much more specific, and much worse than you realized." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages between David and Mike Chen that she'd screenshot before leaving TechFlow. The messages were from the week before my termination, and they revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond workplace betrayal into criminal territory. "Sarah's client relationships are worth more to us if we can transfer them without her involvement," David had written to Mike. "Once she's gone, we can approach her contacts directly and offer them better deals to switch to our premium services. No competition clause means she can't stop us from using everything she built." Mike's response was even more damning. "The timing works perfectly with the Meridian deal. We can package her client list as part of our asset portfolio to increase the acquisition value." Meridian specifically mentioned wanting our customer base as much as our technology. I stared at the messages feeling my blood turn cold. David hadn't just fired me to reduce expenses or eliminate what he saw as unnecessary marketing functions. He'd fired me as part of a deliberate plan to steal my client relationships and sell them to Meridian Technologies, one of TechFlow's main competitors, in what appeared to be an acquisition deal that he'd been negotiating without my knowledge. Rachel watched my face as I processed the implications of what I was reading. "There's more," she said quietly. "David and Mike have been in acquisition talks with Meridian for over 3 months. They're planning to sell TechFlow for somewhere between $12 and $15 million, and they structured your termination specifically to make the client relationships more valuable to potential buyers." The scope of their betrayal was staggering. David hadn't just fired me from my job. He'd systematically planned to steal 8 years of my professional work, sell it to our competitors, and profit from relationships I'd built through my own expertise and dedication. The personal betrayal was devastating, but the business fraud was criminal. "How do you know all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. The condescension was breathtaking. David genuinely believed that he'd done me a favor by destroying what I'd helped build, and he expected me to appreciate his wisdom in recognizing that I wasn't valuable enough to keep. He had no idea that I'd spent the day laying the groundwork for systematic destruction of everything he thought he controlled. I spent that evening packing my personal belongings while David remained oblivious to what was actually happening. I took my clothes, my books, my personal electronics, and a few pieces of furniture that had been mine before our marriage. I left behind everything that connected me to the life we'd shared, including the wedding ring that had become a symbol of trust betrayed rather than love honored. The next morning, I moved out of our house and into the San Antonio apartment permanently. I left David a note explaining that I needed space to process what had happened and figure out my next steps. I told him I'd be staying with friends for a while and would contact him when I was ready to discuss our future. This wasn't entirely dishonest. I did need space, and I was certainly figuring out my next steps. I just wasn't planning to discuss them with him until it was too late for him to respond effectively. From my new headquarters in San Antonio, I began implementing a competitive strategy that would systematically undermine TechFlow's market position. My first target was client retention. I knew that David and Mike had never developed strong personal relationships with TechFlow's major accounts. They saw client management as an administrative function rather than a strategic priority. This gave me an enormous advantage because I had personal relationships with decision makers at every important client company. I started reaching out to key clients, not to steal them immediately, but to maintain the relationships I'd built over 8 years of providing them with excellent service. I called Jennifer Morrison at Morrison Construction Management, telling her I was exploring independent consulting opportunities and wanted to stay connected to the industry. Jennifer had always valued my input on their automation needs, and she was interested in discussing potential projects that might benefit from my expertise. I contacted Roberto Silva at Silva Professional Services, mentioning that I was developing specialized solutions for firms like his and would love to get his feedback on market needs and service gaps. Roberto had been frustrated with TechFlow's limited reporting capabilities for months, and he was eager to discuss alternatives that might better serve his client base. I reached out to Amanda Foster at Foster Restaurant Group, explaining that I was researching scalable solutions for multi-location businesses and respected her insights on operational efficiency. Amanda had been complaining about TechFlow's pricing structure for their 15 locations, and she was very interested in exploring more cost-effective alternatives. These weren't sales calls. They were relationship maintenance conversations. That would become sales opportunities once my competitive platform was ready for market. I was laying the groundwork for client acquisition by positioning myself as a trusted advisor who understood their needs and was working on solutions specifically designed for their challenges. Simultaneously, I was accelerating development of my software platform with Jennifer Liu. We'd been working part-time for months, but now I was funding full-time development that would have us ready for market launch within 6 weeks. Jennifer was excited about the technical challenges of building something superior to existing solutions, and the additional funding allowed her to implement features that would make our platform demonstrably better than TechFlow's offerings. The timing was critical because I knew David would eventually realize that client satisfaction at TechFlow was declining. Without my marketing expertise and client relationship management, the company's service quality would deteriorate rapidly. David and Mike were excellent at building software, but they had no idea how to maintain the customer relationships that generated the revenue to fund their development work. My market research had revealed that TechFlow's clients were already experiencing longer response times for technical support, less personalized service from account management, and reduced flexibility in customizing their software configurations. These problems would worsen as David and Mike tried to manage client relationships without understanding what made those relationships successful. Within 2 weeks of my termination, I was already seeing evidence that TechFlow's operational efficiency was declining. Jennifer Morrison called me to complain that her requests for technical support were taking much longer to resolve. Roberto Silva mentioned that he'd been waiting 3 weeks for answers to questions about integration capabilities that I used to address within hours. Amanda Foster expressed frustration that TechFlow seemed less responsive to her specific needs. As a multi-location business, these weren't random service failures. They were predictable consequences of eliminating the person who had managed client relationships as strategic partnerships rather than administrative obligations. David had fired me believing that client management was a routine function that could be handled by anyone with basic customer service skills. He was discovering that maintaining complex business relationships requires expertise, attention, and personal investment that can't be easily replaced. But the most important development during this period was my growing alliance with Lisa Rodriguez, a financial advisor and CPA who specialized in helping tech companies navigate growth, acquisition, and competitive challenges. Lisa had been recommended by James Wilson as someone who could help me understand the financial aspects of competing with an established company like TechFlow. Lisa's analysis of TechFlow's financial position revealed vulnerabilities that I hadn't fully appreciated. While the company was profitable and growing, it was also heavily dependent on a small number of large clients for the majority of its revenue. Losing just 3 or 4 major accounts would create serious cash flow problems that could threaten the company's operational stability. More importantly, Lisa helped me understand that TechFlow's growth had been funded primarily through reinvested profits rather than external investment. David and Mike owned the company entirely, which gave them complete control but also meant they had limited resources for responding to serious competitive threats. They couldn't quickly raise capital to fund aggressive retention efforts or accelerated product development without giving up equity or taking on debt. This financial structure made TechFlow vulnerable to exactly the kind of targeted competition I was planning. A well-funded competitor who understood the market and could offer superior service at competitive prices could potentially capture enough market share to destabilize TechFlow's revenue base. Because David asked me to help prepare the employee records and client documentation for due diligence reviews, Rachel explained. He wanted me to create detailed reports showing which clients were associated with which employees, how those relationships developed, and what the retention probability would be after staff changes. When I realized what he was planning, I started documenting everything. Rachel had been collecting evidence of David's acquisition planning for weeks, including emails, financial projections, and meeting notes that showed the systematic way he'd been preparing to monetize my client relationships without my involvement or consent. She'd also discovered that the two consultants who had been present during my termination weren't restructuring advisors. They were due diligence specialists, hired by Meridian to evaluate TechFlow's assets. The legal implications were enormous. David had fired me not for legitimate business reasons, but as part of a fraudulent scheme to misrepresent the ownership and transferability of client relationships that I had developed. He was planning to sell my professional work to competitors, while claiming that those relationships belonged to TechFlow rather than to me personally. But Rachel's most shocking revelation was yet to come. David's been telling Meridian that you were just an administrative employee who managed customer service functions, she said, pulling up another set of documents on her phone. He's been systematically minimizing your contributions to make it seem like the client relationships would transfer seamlessly without any key person dependency. The documentation Rachel showed me included David's presentations to Meridian's acquisition team, where he described me as a marketing coordinator whose departure would have minimal impact on customer retention. He'd attributed TechFlow's revenue growth to superior product development and market positioning, while presenting my client relationships as company assets that could be transferred to new ownership without difficulty. This wasn't just fraud. It was identity theft on a professional scale. David was literally stealing credit for my work and selling it to our competitors while ensuring that I couldn't compete or defend my professional reputation. He'd planned my termination not just to hurt me personally, but to eliminate me as a potential threat to his fraudulent representation of TechFlow's value. Rachel had quit TechFlow when she realized the scope of David's deception, but she'd been careful to preserve evidence that could expose his fraudulent acquisition planning. I couldn't be part of what he was doing, she explained. And I knew that eventually someone would need this information to stop him. The documentation Rachel had collected was comprehensive and damning. Email chains showing David's coordination with Meridian's acquisition team. Financial projections that attributed my revenue generation to company systems rather than personal expertise. Client analysis reports that misrepresented the nature of my professional relationships. Due diligence materials that systematically erased my contributions while inflating the transferability of assets I had created. Most importantly, Rachel had recordings of conference calls between David, Mike, and Meridian's executives where they discussed the people risk associated with TechFlow's client relationships. In these recordings, David explicitly stated that my termination had eliminated the primary risk factor for client retention after acquisition, and that Meridian could count on smooth transitions for all major accounts. This changes everything, I told Rachel as we finished reviewing her evidence. David isn't just betraying me personally. He's committing fraud against Meridian and theft against me. And he's doing it with documentation that proves criminal intent. Rachel nodded grimly. There's something else you should know. The acquisition is supposed to close next month. David and Mike are planning to complete the sale, take their money, and disappear before anyone realizes that the client relationships they sold don't actually transfer with the company. The timeline pressure was enormous, but it also created opportunities one hadn't anticipated. If David was planning to sell TechFlow based on fraudulent representations of my client relationships, I could potentially disrupt the acquisition by proving that those relationships belonged to me rather than to the company. More importantly, I could expose his fraud to Meridian, potentially making them interested in acquiring my competing business instead of David's hollow shell. That afternoon, I called James Wilson to schedule an emergency meeting. The evidence Rachel had provided changed the legal landscape completely, transforming my competitive strategy from business rivalry into fraud investigation and potential criminal prosecution. James needed to understand the full scope of David's deception so we could plan appropriate responses. The meeting with James took place that same evening at his downtown office. I brought Rachel with me so she could provide first-hand testimony about David's fraudulent acquisition planning. James listened carefully as we outlined the evidence of systematic fraud, identity theft, and misrepresentation that David had been implementing for months. "This is criminal conspiracy," James said after reviewing Rachel's documentation. "David isn't just competing unfairly or misrepresenting his company's assets. He's committing deliberate fraud against multiple parties, including you, Meridian, and potentially the clients whose relationships he's misrepresenting." James explained that David's scheme violated multiple federal and state laws related to fraud, misrepresentation, and theft of intellectual property. The systematic nature of his deception, combined with the interstate commerce implications of selling client relationships across state lines, made this a federal crime that could result in serious prison time if prosecuted successfully. But James also warned me that criminal prosecution could take years, and David might complete his fraudulent acquisition before law enforcement could intervene effectively. "We need to think about civil remedies that can stop him immediately," James said. "And we need to consider whether exposing his fraud to Meridian might be more effective than waiting for criminal investigations." The strategy we developed that evening was multifaceted and aggressive. James would file an immediate injunction to prevent the completion of TechFlow's acquisition based on fraudulent misrepresentation of assets. Rachel would provide sworn testimony about David's systematic deception and criminal planning. I would approach Meridian directly to inform them about the fraud and offer them a legitimate alternative to David's fraudulent deal. Most importantly, we would accelerate my competitive timeline to demonstrate that the client relationships David was trying to sell actually belonged to me and would not transfer with TechFlow's acquisition. This would require launching my competing business immediately, even though my software platform wasn't completely finished. That night, I called Jennifer Liu to explain that we needed to accelerate our development timeline from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. I was prepared to fund whatever resources were necessary to get our platform ready for market launch, because the window for disrupting David's fraud was closing rapidly. Jennifer was excited about the technical challenge of compressed development, and the additional funding allowed her to bring in 2 additional developers who could work around the clock to implement the remaining features. We established a war room development schedule that would have our platform ready for beta testing within 10 days and ready for full market launch within 2 weeks. Simultaneously, I began reaching out to my client contacts to inform them about the acquisition discussions and give them advance notice that I would soon be offering them superior alternatives to TechFlow services. I couldn't directly inform them about David's fraudulent representation of our professional relationships, but I could certainly let them know that I was launching a competing business that would provide better service at lower costs. The response from clients was immediate and enthusiastic. Jennifer Morrison at Morrison Construction Management was thrilled to learn that I was developing solutions specifically designed for her industry's needs. Roberto Silva at Silva Professional Services expressed interest in beta testing my platform's advanced reporting capabilities. Amanda Foster at Foster Restaurant Group wanted early access to my scalable pricing structure for multi-location businesses. Most importantly, every client I contacted confirmed that their relationship was with me personally rather than with TechFlow as a company. They had chosen TechFlow originally because of my recommendations and market expertise, and they had stayed with TechFlow because of the personalized service I provided. Without me, they were already experiencing declining satisfaction and exploring alternative solutions. This client feedback provided crucial evidence for James's legal strategy. David's representations to Meridian that client relationships would transfer smoothly after acquisition were demonstrably false. The clients themselves were stating clearly that their loyalty was to me rather than to TechFlow, and that they would follow me to a competing platform if I could provide better service. But the most significant development came when I decided to approach Tom Anderson, a former TechFlow employee who had been laid off 6 months earlier as part of David's cost-cutting measures. Tom had been TechFlow's senior customer success manager, and he had intimate knowledge of client satisfaction issues and retention challenges that David had been hiding from potential acquirers. Tom was bitter about his termination and eager to share information about TechFlow's declining service quality and growing client dissatisfaction. He confirmed that client complaints had increased dramatically since his departure, and that David and Mike had been covering up service problems to maintain appearances during acquisition negotiations. David's been lying to Meridian about client satisfaction scores, Tom told me during our meeting at a coffee shop near his new workplace. He's been presenting doctored reports that hide declining retention rates and growing service complaints. The real numbers show that TechFlow is losing clients faster than they're gaining new ones. Tom had maintained copies of authentic client satisfaction reports, retention analysis, and service quality metrics that contradicted David's representations to Meridian. This documentation proved that TechFlow's client base was actually declining in value rather than maintaining the stability that David had been promising to potential acquirers. More importantly, Tom was willing to provide testimony about David's systematic deception regarding client relationships and service quality. He had first-hand knowledge of conversations where David had explicitly discussed hiding client dissatisfaction from acquisition due diligence processes. With Tom's evidence, Rachel's documentation, and my own proof of client relationship ownership, James felt confident that we could not only stop David's fraudulent acquisition but potentially expose him to criminal prosecution for fraud and misrepresentation. The legal filing was comprehensive and devastating. James submitted an emergency injunction request that detailed David's systematic fraud, supported by sworn testimony from Rachel and Tom, documented by emails and recorded conversations, and corroborated by client statements confirming that their relationships were with me rather than with TechFlow. The injunction request also included a demand for immediate forensic accounting of TechFlow's financial representations to Meridian, preservation of all acquisition-related documentation, and suspension of all sale negotiations pending investigation of fraudulent misrepresentation. But perhaps most importantly, James included in our legal filing a formal offer from Austin Business Automation Solutions to provide Meridian with legitimate access to the client relationships and market expertise that David had been fraudulently claiming to own. If Meridian was interested in acquiring business automation capabilities and client relationships, we could provide them with authentic access to both. The response from Meridian was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours of receiving our legal filing, they suspended all acquisition negotiations with TechFlow and requested an immediate meeting with me to discuss the allegations of fraud and misrepresentation. They were particularly interested in learning about my competing platform and whether Austin Business Automation Solutions might represent a legitimate alternative to their planned TechFlow acquisition. David's reaction was predictable and self-destructive. Instead of acknowledging the fraud and attempting damage control, he doubled down on his false representations and began making threats against me, Rachel, and Tom for interfering with legitimate business operations. These threats were made in writing through his attorney, creating additional evidence of consciousness of guilt and obstruction of justice. Mike Chen, faced with exposure of his complicity in David's fraud, immediately distanced himself from the acquisition planning and began cooperating with Meridian's investigation. He provided them with authentic financial records, client satisfaction data, and documentation that contradicted many of David's representations about TechFlow's stability and growth prospects. The unraveling was rapid and comprehensive. Within a week of our legal intervention, Meridian had terminated all acquisition discussions with TechFlow. David was facing potential criminal charges for fraud and misrepresentation, and I was scheduled for meetings with Meridian's executives to discuss potential partnerships with Austin Business Automation Solutions. But the most satisfying moment came when several of TechFlow's major clients, informed about the acquisition discussions and David's fraudulent representation of their relationships, formally terminated their contracts and expressed interest in switching to my new platform. Jennifer Morrison, Roberto Silva, and Amanda Foster all confirmed that they had never authorized David to represent their business relationships as transferable company assets. The systematic destruction of David's fraudulent scheme was complete, but the opportunity it created for my own business was just beginning. Meridian's interest in partnering with Austin Business Automation Solutions opened possibilities I hadn't anticipated when I first started planning my competitive response to David's betrayal. What had started as a plan to compete with my former husband's business had evolved into something much larger and more significant. I wasn't just proving that David had made a mistake by firing me. I was exposing systematic fraud that could send him to prison while building a business that could become a major player in the business automation industry. The woman who had been fired for being supposedly unnecessary to TechFlow's success was about to demonstrate that she had been the only thing standing between David and complete professional destruction. And the best part was that David had created this situation entirely through his own arrogance and criminal stupidity. The meeting with Meridian Technologies' executive team took place at their corporate headquarters in Dallas, exactly 7 weeks after David had fired me from what he thought was his company. I walked into that glass-walled conference room carrying a presentation that would not only expose the full extent of David's fraud but demonstrate why Austin Business Automation Solutions represented everything Meridian had been trying to acquire through their failed TechFlow deal. The Meridian team included CEO Marcus Webb, Chief Technology Officer Dr. Patricia Kim, and Head of Business Development Sarah Walsh. They had spent 3 months conducting due diligence on TechFlow based on David's representations, and they were understandably frustrated to discover that much of what they'd been told was systematically false. More importantly, they were facing pressure from their board of directors to explain how their acquisition team had been deceived so completely. Before we discuss potential partnerships, Marcus Webb said as we settled around the conference table, we need to understand exactly how extensive the misrepresentations were in our TechFlow discussions. Our legal team is considering fraud charges, but we want to understand the business implications before we decide how to proceed. I had prepared for this conversation by creating a comprehensive analysis that compared David's representations to Meridian against the documented reality of TechFlow's operations. Using Rachel's evidence, Tom's testimony, and my own client relationship documentation, I could prove that virtually every major claim David had made about TechFlow's stability and growth potential was false. David told you that TechFlow's client retention rate was over 90%, I began, distributing printed reports that told a very different story. The actual retention rate for the past 12 months was 67%, and it's been declining consistently since I was terminated. He presented doctored satisfaction surveys that had growing client complaints about responsiveness and service quality. Dr. Kim studied the authentic client satisfaction data that Tom had preserved during his tenure as customer success manager. These numbers show systematic service deterioration over the past year, she said. How did David hide this during our due diligence process? I explained David's strategy of presenting selective data that supported his narrative while concealing information that revealed TechFlow's operational problems. He had shown Meridian quarterly revenue figures without mentioning that much of that revenue came from one-time setup fees rather than recurring subscriptions. He had highlighted new client acquisitions while failing to mention the accelerating rate of client departures. Most damaging was David's misrepresentation of client relationship ownership. I showed Meridian the documented evidence that major clients considered their relationships to be with me personally rather than with TechFlow as a company. Jennifer Morrison, Roberto Silva, Amanda Foster, and 3 other major accounts had provided written statements confirming that they had chosen TechFlow based on my recommendations and expertise, and that they would not have renewed their contracts after my departure. This means that the client base David was selling to you was essentially worthless, Sarah Walsh observed. Without the personal relationships that generated the revenue, TechFlow is just software without customers. But the conversation shifted when I began demonstrating Austin Business Automation Solutions platform and explaining how my company could provide Meridian with authentic access to the market opportunities they had been seeking through the TechFlow acquisition. My software was demonstrably superior to TechFlow's offerings, my client relationships were genuine and transferable, and my market knowledge was current and actionable. Jennifer Liu had done extraordinary work completing our platform development under compressed timelines. The software we demonstrated to Meridian included advanced features that TechFlow had been promising clients for years but never delivered. Our customization capabilities, integration options, and scalable pricing structure addressed every major complaint I'd heard from business automation clients during my 8 years in the industry. More importantly, I could offer Meridian something David never could: authentic partnership with someone who understood both the technical and market aspects of business automation software. David was a competent programmer, but he had never understood why clients chose specific solutions or what drove their purchasing decisions. My marketing expertise, combined with superior technology, represented genuine competitive advantage rather than fraudulent misrepresentation. The response from Meridian's team was immediate and enthusiastic. Dr. Kim was impressed by our technical architecture, which solved integration problems that had plagued TechFlow's clients for years. Sarah Walsh was excited about our go-to-market strategy, which was based on documented client needs rather than assumptions about market demand. Marcus Webb was interested in the partnership possibilities that could give Meridian immediate access to business automation markets without the risk and expense of building capabilities internally. What would a partnership structure look like? Marcus asked as we concluded the technical demonstration. I had prepared several partnership models ranging from licensing agreements to acquisition discussions, but I was particularly interested in a joint venture structure that would allow Austin Business Automation Solutions to maintain independence while benefiting from Meridian's resources and market reach. This would give me access to capital and infrastructure for rapid scaling while protecting my control over strategic decisions and client relationships. The preliminary partnership terms we discussed were more favorable than anything I had imagined. When I first started planning my response to David's betrayal, Meridian was prepared to provide significant funding for platform development and market expansion, access to their enterprise sales team for larger client opportunities, and technical resources for accelerated feature development. In exchange, they would receive revenue sharing from joint clients and potential equity participation if we decided to pursue acquisition discussions in the future. But the most satisfying aspect of the Meridian partnership was how it would position Austin Business Automation Solutions as a direct competitor to TechFlow in the market segments where David thought he was strongest. With Meridian's backing, I could offer clients better technology, superior service, and more competitive pricing than TechFlow could match. I could also scale rapidly enough to capture market share before David could respond effectively to the competitive threat. The legal implications of our partnership discussions were equally important. By demonstrating that Meridian could achieve their acquisition objectives through legitimate partnership with Austin Business Automation Solutions, we were proving that David's fraudulent TechFlow representations had caused measurable financial harm. Meridian had spent months and significant resources pursuing an acquisition that was based entirely on false information, and they now had grounds for substantial fraud claims against David and TechFlow. James Wilson joined us for the legal aspects of our partnership discussions, and he confirmed that Meridian's cooperation would strengthen our criminal fraud case against David while protecting our business partnership from potential interference. Meridian's legal team was prepared to provide testimony about David's systematic misrepresentations, and their documentation of his false claims would support federal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. The acceleration of events over the following week was remarkable even by the standards of everything that had happened since my termination. Meridian's legal team filed formal fraud complaints against David and TechFlow, seeking damages for the resources they had wasted on due diligence. For a fundamentally misrepresented acquisition target, the FBI opened an investigation into David's interstate fraud scheme, focusing on his systematic deception of potential acquirers and theft of professional relationships. Most importantly, news of the fraud investigation and failed acquisition spread throughout Austin's tech community, destroying David's professional reputation and making it nearly impossible for him to secure alternative funding or partnership opportunities. The industry consensus was that David had committed career suicide by attempting to defraud a major potential partner, and that TechFlow was now effectively worthless as a business entity. The client exodus from TechFlow was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks of the fraud exposure, 8 of TechFlow's 12 major clients had terminated their contracts and expressed interest in switching to Austin Business Automation Solutions. Jennifer Morrison formally ended Morrison Construction Management's relationship with TechFlow and signed a partnership agreement with my company that was worth more annually than her previous TechFlow contract. Roberto Silva and Amanda Foster followed similar patterns, bringing their business to my platform along with referrals to other companies in their industries. David's response to these developments was predictably desperate and self-destructive. Instead of acknowledging his fraud and attempting to minimize legal exposure, he began making public statements claiming that I had stolen proprietary information and client relationships that belonged to TechFlow. These statements were demonstrably false and provided additional evidence of his willingness to commit fraud even when facing criminal investigation. More damaging for David was Mike Chen's decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Mike provided detailed testimony about David's fraud planning, including recordings of conversations where David had explicitly discussed deceiving potential acquirers about client relationship ownership and service quality metrics. Mike's cooperation eliminated any possibility that David could claim ignorance or minimize his culpability for the systematic fraud scheme. The federal investigation revealed that David's fraudulent representations extended beyond his discussions with Meridian to include false statements to banks, investors, and business partners over a period of more than 18 months. He had been systematically inflating TechFlow's value and stability while hiding operational problems and declining client satisfaction. The scope of his deception was so extensive that prosecutors were considering charges under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which could result in decades in federal prison. But perhaps the most personally satisfying development was the response from our shared social and professional network in Austin's tech community. People who had known both David and me for years were expressing shock at his fraudulent behavior and admiration for my strategic response to his betrayal. Industry colleagues who had initially been confused by news of my termination were now understanding that David had fired me as part of a criminal conspiracy, and that my competitive response had exposed fraud that could have harmed multiple companies and investors. The transformation in how people viewed our situation was complete and irreversible. David was no longer seen as a successful entrepreneur who had made difficult but reasonable business decisions. He was viewed as a criminal who had betrayed his wife, defrauded potential partners, and stolen credit for work he hadn't done. I was no longer seen as a disgruntled former employee pursuing vindictive competition. I was viewed as a fraud victim who had responded with intelligence and integrity to systematic betrayal. The preliminary partnership agreement with Meridian was finalized exactly 8 weeks after my termination from TechFlow. The signing ceremony took place at Meridian's Dallas headquarters, with Marcus Webb, Dr. Kim, and Sarah Walsh expressing their enthusiasm about working with someone who represented authentic expertise rather than fraudulent misrepresentation. The partnership provided Austin Business Automation Solutions with immediate access to enterprise markets, technical resources for advanced platform development, and financial backing for aggressive competitive expansion. But the most significant moment of that signing ceremony was when Marcus Webb made an unexpected observation about the broader implications of our partnership. This situation demonstrates why authentic relationships and genuine expertise are more valuable than any fraudulent scheme, he said. David thought he could sell us client relationships and market knowledge that didn't belong to him. Instead, he led us to someone who actually owns those relationships and has legitimate expertise to offer. The irony was perfect and complete. David's attempt to defraud Meridian had resulted in them partnering with me instead, providing me with resources and opportunities that I never could have accessed independently. His criminal conspiracy to steal credit for my work had ended up directing attention and investment toward my legitimate business. His systematic fraud had become the catalyst for my authentic success. The public announcement of our partnership generated immediate interest from potential clients, industry analysts, and investors who were impressed by Austin Business Automation Solutions' rapid emergence as a serious competitor in the business automation market. The combination of superior technology, authentic client relationships, and Meridian's backing positioned my company as a potential market leader rather than just another startup attempting to compete with established players. David's reaction to news of our partnership was a mixture of rage and desperation that confirmed everything I had learned about his character during the months since my termination. He began making increasingly erratic public statements claiming that I had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to steal his business, that Meridian was participating in corporate espionage, and that federal investigators were pursuing politically motivated charges based on false information. These statements provided additional evidence for prosecutors building their fraud case against David, but they also revealed the complete breakdown of his judgment and self-control. The man who had fired me believing he was demonstrating superior business intelligence was now publicly destroying what remained of his professional credibility through paranoid accusations and obvious lies. Mike Chen, now cooperating fully with federal authorities, confirmed that David's behavior had been deteriorating for months as the pressure of maintaining his fraudulent representations became more difficult to manage. David had been lying to so many different people about so many different aspects of TechFlow's operations that he had essentially lost track of what was true and what was false in his own business. The federal indictment was filed exactly 10 weeks after my termination, charging David with 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and theft related to his systematic deception of potential acquirers and misappropriation of professional relationships. The charges carried potential sentences totaling over 40 years in federal prison, and prosecutors indicated that they were confident of conviction based on the extensive documentary evidence and cooperating witness testimony they had collected. But by the time David was arrested at TechFlow's offices in front of his remaining employees, I was already focused on building Austin Business Automation Solutions into everything that TechFlow could have become if it had been managed with integrity and authentic expertise. The partnership with Meridian was accelerating our development timeline, expanding our market reach, and providing access to enterprise opportunities that would establish us as a legitimate industry leader within months, rather than years. The woman who had been fired for supposedly being unnecessary to TechFlow's continued success was about to demonstrate that she had been the only thing preventing David's inevitable self-destruction. And the business he had tried to steal from me was about to become the foundation for success that exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. The trial began 18 months after David had fired me from what he believed was his company, in a federal courthouse in Austin where the media attention had transformed our personal and professional conflict into a cautionary tale about fraud, betrayal, and the consequences of underestimating the people who build your success. I sat in the front row of the gallery, no longer the shocked and devastated wife who had discovered her husband's criminal conspiracy, but as the CEO of Austin Business Automation Solutions, a company that had grown from my strategic response to betrayal into one of the most respected business automation providers in the Southwest. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Federal prosecutors presented 18 months of evidence showing David's systematic fraud, from his misrepresentations to Meridian Technologies to his theft of client relationships that he had never owned. The documentation was comprehensive, including recorded conversations, email chains, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed David's criminal planning and execution. Marcus Webb from Meridian testified about the millions of dollars his company had wasted pursuing an acquisition based on David's fraudulent representations. Mike Chen, now serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, provided detailed testimony about David's conspiracy to steal my professional relationships and sell them to competitors. Rachel Thompson and Tom Anderson testified about David's systematic deception regarding TechFlow's operational problems and declining client satisfaction. But the most powerful testimony came from the clients themselves. Jennifer Morrison, Roberto Silva, and Amanda Foster each took the stand to explain how their business relationships had been with me personally rather than with TechFlow as a company, and how David had never had the authority to represent those relationships as transferable corporate assets. Their testimony demolished any remaining claim David might have had to legitimate ownership of the client base he had tried to sell. David's defense strategy was as delusional as his behavior had been throughout the investigation. His attorneys attempted to portray him as a victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by me, Meridian, and federal prosecutors to destroy an innocent entrepreneur who had made reasonable business decisions under difficult circumstances. They claimed that his representations to potential acquirers had been good faith estimates rather than deliberate fraud, and that his termination of my employment had been a legitimate business decision rather than part of a criminal scheme. The defense strategy collapsed completely when prosecutors played recordings of David's conversations with Mike Chen where they had explicitly discussed deceiving potential acquirers about client relationship ownership and service quality metrics. David's own words proved criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt, and his attempts to claim ignorance or good faith were contradicted by extensive evidence of systematic planning and deliberate deception. The most damaging moment for David came when prosecutors presented evidence of his behavior after the fraud investigation began. Instead of cooperating with authorities or attempting to minimize harm to the people he had defrauded, David had continued making false statements, threatening witnesses, and attempting to obstruct justice. His post-investigation conduct demonstrated consciousness of guilt and lack of remorse that eliminated any possibility of leniency. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Judge Maria Rodriguez sentenced David to 28 years in federal prison, noting that his systematic deception had harmed multiple victims and demonstrated a complete disregard for business ethics and legal obligations. The sentence effectively meant that David would spend the rest of his productive life in prison, paying for his decision to betray the person who had been most responsible for his business success. But the trial was only the conclusion of David's destruction, not the culmination of my transformation. By the time David was sentenced to federal prison, Austin Business Automation Solutions had grown far beyond anything TechFlow had ever achieved. Our partnership with Meridian had provided access to enterprise markets that generated more revenue in 6 months than TechFlow had produced in its best year. Our platform had evolved to include advanced features that established us as innovation leaders rather than just competitors in the business automation space. The client base that David had tried to steal and sell had not only remained with my company but had expanded through referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied customers who appreciated working with a company that prioritized authentic relationships over deceptive sales tactics. Jennifer Morrison had referred 3 other construction management companies to our platform. Roberto Silva had introduced us to a network of professional services firms that became some of our most valuable long-term clients. Amanda Foster had helped us develop specialized solutions for multi-location restaurants that opened entirely new market segments. Most importantly, the publicity surrounding David's fraud trial had positioned Austin Business Automation Solutions as a company built on integrity and authentic expertise rather than deceptive marketing and fraudulent representations. Industry analysts praised our transparent business practices, our commitment to client success, and our innovative approach to solving real problems rather than just selling software. The contrast with David's criminal behavior had become a competitive advantage that attracted clients who valued ethical business relationships. The financial success exceeded every projection I had made during my early planning stages. Austin Business Automation Solutions generated over $15 million in revenue during our second year of operation, making us larger and more profitable than TechFlow had ever been even at its peak. Our growth was sustainable and organic, based on genuine client satisfaction rather than deceptive marketing or fraudulent representations of our capabilities. But perhaps more satisfying than the financial success was the professional vindication of everything I had built during my 8 years at TechFlow. Industry recognition confirmed that I had been the primary architect of TechFlow's success, and that David's contributions had been limited to technical implementation of strategies I had developed. Awards from business automation industry associations, speaking invitations at major conferences, and profile features in trade publications established me as a thought leader whose expertise was sought by companies throughout the technology sector. The personal healing took longer than the professional success, but it was equally complete and transformative. I had entered therapy immediately after David's arrest to process not just the trauma of discovering his betrayal but the deeper psychological impact of realizing that my marriage had been built on manipulation and deception. Dr. Patricia Wong specialized in helping survivors of intimate partner financial abuse understand that they were not responsible for their abuser's criminal behavior. The therapy process helped me understand how David's manipulation had been systematic and sophisticated, designed to make me doubt my own value while positioning himself as the essential element in any success we achieved together. He had been gaslighting me for years, minimizing my contributions while inflating his own importance in ways that were subtle enough to avoid detection but pervasive enough to undermine my confidence and independence. But the therapy also helped me recognize the strength and resilience I had demonstrated in responding to David's betrayal. Instead of accepting his narrative that I was disposable, I had trusted my own knowledge and expertise to build something superior to what he thought he controlled. Instead of being destroyed by his criminal conspiracy, I had used it as motivation to achieve success that exceeded anything we had accomplished together. 18 months after David's sentencing, I remarried. Dr. Kevin Martinez was a business ethics professor at the University of Texas who specialized in studying corporate fraud and white-collar crime. We had met at a conference where I was speaking about building ethical business cultures, and he was presenting research on the psychological factors that lead entrepreneurs to commit fraud against their partners and investors. Kevin's academic expertise helped me understand David's criminal behavior in broader context, recognizing that spousal financial abuse and business fraud often involve similar patterns of manipulation and control. But more importantly, Kevin represented everything that David had never been: intellectually honest, emotionally supportive, and genuinely committed to building relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance and exploitation. Our wedding took place at the Austin Business Automation Solutions headquarters, surrounded by the team of employees who had helped build the company from my strategic response to betrayal into a legitimate industry leader. Jennifer Liu, who had become our Chief Technology Officer, served as my maid of honor. Rachel Thompson, now our Director of Human Resources, managed the ceremony logistics. Tom Anderson, our Director of Client Success, provided music for the reception. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. I was celebrating not just personal happiness but professional achievement in the building that housed the company David had thought he could destroy by firing me. The people who had helped me expose his fraud and build authentic success were witnessing my commitment to a relationship based on honesty and partnership rather than manipulation and control. But the most meaningful moment of our wedding celebration came when Marcus Webb from Meridian presented Austin Business Automation Solutions with a partnership expansion that would provide access to international markets and enterprise opportunities in sectors we had never considered entering. The expansion represented recognition that our company had evolved from a competitive response to David's fraud into a legitimate industry leader with capabilities that extended far beyond our original market focus. The international expansion succeeded beyond every projection we had developed. Austin Business Automation Solutions opened offices in Toronto, London, and Sydney, serving enterprise clients whose automation needs required sophisticated solutions that we had developed specifically to address complex operational challenges. Our platform evolved to include artificial intelligence capabilities, advanced analytics features, and integration options that positioned us as innovation leaders rather than just service providers. 5 years after David had fired me believing he was eliminating an unnecessary expense, Austin Business Automation Solutions was acquired by a Fortune 500 technology company for $180 million. The acquisition was structured to maintain our operational independence while providing access to resources and markets that would support continued growth and innovation. I remained as CEO of the Austin Business Automation Division, with expanded responsibilities for developing automation solutions across the parent company's entire technology portfolio. The acquisition announcement generated significant media attention, not just because of the financial success but because of the remarkable story of transformation from corporate betrayal to industry leadership. Business magazines featured our company as an example of how authentic expertise and ethical business practices create sustainable competitive advantages that fraudulent schemes can never match. But the most personally satisfying aspect of the acquisition was the message I received from Jennifer Morrison, now CEO of a construction management company that had grown to over 200 employees with the help of our automation solutions. "You didn't just survive David's betrayal," she wrote. "You transformed it into something that made all of us more successful. That's the definition of turning adversity into triumph." The contrast with David's situation could not have been more complete. While I was celebrating the acquisition of my company and planning international expansion of our services, David was serving the 7th year of his federal prison sentence, with no possibility of parole for another 21 years. His name had become synonymous with fraud and betrayal in Austin's business community, and his former colleagues avoided any association with his criminal behavior. TechFlow Solutions had been liquidated within months of David's conviction, with its remaining assets sold to pay restitution to fraud victims and cover legal expenses. The office building where David had fired me thinking he was demonstrating his power over my career had been converted into a co-working space for ethical startups that prioritized sustainable growth over deceptive shortcuts. Mike Chen, after serving 18 months in federal prison, had relocated to another state and was working in technical support for a software company that specialized in compliance and fraud prevention. His cooperation with federal prosecutors had reduced his sentence, but his professional reputation had been permanently damaged by his participation in David's criminal conspiracy. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The woman who had been fired for supposedly being unnecessary to her husband's company had built something far more successful than anything he had ever achieved or imagined. The professional relationships he had tried to steal and sell had become the foundation for authentic success that created value for clients, employees, and partners rather than extracting it through fraud and manipulation. 7 years after that devastating day in TechFlow's conference room, I stood in the boardroom of Austin Business Automation Solutions preparing for a presentation to potential clients who were seeking automation solutions for their growing businesses. The irony was perfect and satisfying. Companies were now seeking my expertise and paying premium prices for services that David had thought were unnecessary and disposable. The lesson was clear and permanent. Success built on authentic expertise and ethical relationships is always more sustainable than schemes based on fraud and betrayal. David had thought he could steal credit for my work and profit from relationships I had built. Instead, his criminal conspiracy had freed me to demonstrate that I had been the source of everything valuable he thought he controlled. The woman who walked out of TechFlow carrying a box of personal items had been replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous thing you can do to a competent person is to give them nothing left to lose. David had turned his greatest asset into his most effective competitor, and the competition had destroyed everything he thought he owned while creating something far more valuable than anything he had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.